In the darkest reaches of the galaxy where war rages unchecked between the Coral and Xthar, two species locked in an endless battle of survival, one message echoes across the void, a desperate cry from a mother for help. The Coral Queen, Nvothra, had never been known for weakness, her reign marked by ruthless efficiency and unyielding control. Her people were soldiers born from the void, bred for war. But now her voice trembled in the stillness of space as the message reached the human military stationed on the far edge of the sector. The signal cut through the cold silence like a blade, and for the briefest moment, it felt as if time itself paused. The human fleet was scattered across a dozen worlds, barely keeping peace between their own colonies, under constant threat from alien forces. But this was different. No other species had ever made a request like this, not from the Coral, who had always viewed humans as primitive. But now something had changed, and Nvothra spoke, as though her very heart had cracked, and her message sent a ripple through the commanders gathered in the darkened war room aboard the human flagship Resolute. "Human, my daughter needs you." The words hung in the air, heavy with an urgency that could not be ignored. The calm professionalism of the officers flickered for a moment, their eyes meeting in uneasy silence. No one knew what to make of this. Not at first. The Coral were known for their cold logic, their ability to detach emotions from decisions. And yet here was this plea, raw and vulnerable, a mother's desperation for her child. The briefing was chaotic as senior officers and strategists debated the message, a request to rescue a Coral princess from the clutches of the Xthar, an enemy species so alien, so utterly different from anything the humans had encountered before. Their motives were inscrutable, their actions brutal. The Xthar were relentless killers known for their strategy and cunning, their ability to twist the battlefield into a death trap. But to involve humans in such a conflict was a gamble few were willing to take. Lieutenant Michael Reynolds sat at the back of the room, his eyes fixed on the holographic display of the Coral Queen's face, etched with years of war. Yet now her eyes were filled with a rawness never before seen by human eyes. He had seen horrors in his years of service, but this was something different. It stirred something in him, a sense of duty he couldn't ignore despite the tension of the room. Reynolds felt a pull toward this mission, something he couldn't explain, the weight of it pressing on his chest, as if the galaxy itself were holding its breath. He knew the risks far too well. The Xthar would never let this go unanswered. If they even suspected the humans were involved, the consequences would be catastrophic. The war would escalate beyond anything they could control. But then there was the Queen's plea, "My daughter needs you." That one line haunted him. As the days passed by, she wasn't asking for soldiers, she wasn't asking for weapons, she was asking for him, a human. As the discussion raged on, Reynolds stood up, his voice steady despite the storm of doubts swirling in his mind. "I'll do it," he said, his decision like a shot in the dark. It came before he could think it through, the words slipping out before he could call them back. The room fell silent and all eyes turned toward him. "Lieutenant, what are you suggesting?" the Admiral asked, his voice laced with skepticism. "I'm suggesting we send a team," Reynolds replied, his jaw set with a determination that cut through the uncertainty. "I'll go myself. We have to get to her before the Xthar use her as a weapon. We can't afford to wait any longer." The silence in the room was deafening as the Admiral looked at him for a long moment, the weight of the decision hanging in the air before he spoke. "Very well," the Admiral said reluctantly. "Prepare yourself, Lieutenant. You leave within the hour." Reynolds nodded as the officers filed out of the room, the gravity of his choice settling over him with every passing second. The stakes had never been higher, and as he prepared to step into the unknown, a single question burned in his mind: why had the Queen called on a human? Reynolds sat alone in his quarters, staring at the blinking lights of the data terminal, the soft hum of the ship the only sound breaking the silence outside the glass. He could feel the weight of his decision pressing down on him, like the gravity of a distant planet. Every nerve in his body screamed for him to reconsider. It was a mission that had no place for humans, a request too strange, too dangerous for anyone with sense to entertain. Yet here he was preparing to fly into the heart of enemy territory, where the Xthar waited, their insectoid eyes scanning the stars for any sign of an intruder. He didn't belong here. His kind had no place in this war. The coral were a cold species, efficient but unfeeling. They had no concept of empathy, no understanding of the things that made humans human. And yet this was different. This was a mother's plea, not a political maneuver, not a strategic advantage. It was personal. She was asking for him, specifically for him. The message had been clear, her words, now echoing in his mind. "Human, my daughter needs you." He couldn't shake the way it sounded, the desperation in her voice, the fear for her daughter. Something about it had struck a chord deep inside him, a place he had long buried, the memories of the loved ones he had lost in previous wars, the people who had died fighting battles that meant nothing in the grand scheme of things. He stood up, pacing the small space of his quarters, trying to shake off the gnawing feeling of doubt. It had been years since he had felt that pull, the desire to protect something, to fight for something greater than himself. But this was different. This was an alien child caught in the crossfire of a war she never asked for, and her mother, the Coral Queen herself, needed his help. "Why me?" he asked again, but the answer refused to come, even as the countdown to departure grew shorter. His team would be ready by the time the ship was prepped. They were an experienced group, no strangers to danger. But this mission was unlike anything they had ever faced, and Reynolds knew the risks all too well. The Xthar were relentless. They would stop at nothing to ensure their enemy did not have the power to turn the tide of the war in their favor, and Clyra was the key to that power. She was not just the Queen's daughter. She was a living weapon, a being born to wield an ancient coral weapon that could decimate entire fleets. The thought of it made him uneasy, the thought that this young alien girl was at the center of it all, a weapon with the potential to destroy everything if it fell into the wrong hands. And yet, the Queen had trusted him with her. She had asked for his help, not for a fleet or an army, but for a single human soldier, and Reynolds couldn't help but wonder if this was a test, not just of his skills, but of humanity itself. As he strapped into the cockpit of the stealth ship, the hum of the engines reverberating through his bones, Reynolds felt the familiar rush of adrenaline kick in the ship would take them to the heart of the Xthar Empire, a place where death was the only certainty, where humans were considered nothing more than insects to be crushed beneath their feet. But he couldn't back down now, not after everything he had seen, not after hearing her plea. The unknowns loomed large ahead, but he couldn't let fear hold him back, not when there was a life on the line, not when there was a chance to prove something greater. He looked at the holomap of the Xthar homeworld blinking before him. The terrain was jagged and hostile, the atmosphere suffocating, yet it would be nothing compared to the dangers they would face on the ground. Once they landed, he wasn't just taking on an alien army. He was about to step into a web of lies and betrayal, and the only thing standing between success and failure was the fragile thread of trust between him and Clyra. Reynolds took a deep breath, his hand hovering over the launch sequence. It was too late to turn back now. The mission was set, and the stakes were clear. This was no longer just about war. This was about saving a life, and perhaps in doing so saving the future of an entire galaxy. The stealth ship cut through the emptiness of space like a shadow, flitting through the void. Reynolds sat in the cockpit, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the control panel, his mind racing through the mission ahead. The vast distance between the human colonies and the Xthar stronghold was dizzying. But it wasn't the distance that troubled him. It was the uncertainty, the unknowns, the chance that they might not make it back at all. Every decision had been made in haste. No plans were certain. The risks were off the charts. And yet here he was with a small team of seasoned soldiers headed into a war zone they had no place being in. Reynolds' second-in-command, Sergeant Harper, sat beside him, his eyes scanning the holographic display with a focus that never wavered. Harper was a calm presence in the chaos, always grounded in the reality of the situation, where Reynolds sometimes let his emotions lead him. Harper balanced that with a cold pragmatism. It was a partnership that had seen them through countless battles. But this mission was different. There was a weight to it, an undercurrent of danger that neither of them could shake. Harper finally broke the silence. "You think this is a trap, sir?" Harper's voice was low but steady. Reynolds hesitated before responding, his eyes flicking to the display, showing their approach to the asteroid field that surrounded the Xthar system. "It could be," he said finally, "but we can't afford to think like that. We have to assume the Queen's request is legitimate, that we're the only ones who can help her daughter." Harper nodded, but the tension in his posture betrayed his thoughts. He didn't believe it any more than Reynolds did, but the mission had been set in motion, and they couldn't turn back now. The rest of the team was below decks, preparing for the ground assault, but Reynolds knew they'd need more than just military training to survive whatever lay ahead. The Exile weren't just soldiers, they were predators, clever and ruthless, and they knew the terrain better than any human ever could. The asteroid field ahead loomed large like a graveyard of ancient rocks. The ship was small, sleek, designed to slip through the gaps without being detected, but as they neared the field, a warning light began flashing on the console. The ship's sensors picked up a massive energy surge ahead. Reynolds' gut twisted as he glanced at the screen. "Shit," he muttered. Before anyone could react, the ship lurched violently as a blast of energy slammed into their hull. The impact rattled every bone in Reynolds' body. He gripped the controls as Harper barked orders below decks. The rest of the crew scrambled to their stations, but it was too late. The Exthar had found them. "We've been detected," Harper shouted, his voice tight with urgency. The ship was caught in the gravitational pull of a massive Exthar warship, looming out of the darkness, its sleek black surface barely visible against the backdrop of the stars. "Hold on," Reynolds barked, slamming his fist into the control panel. The ship lurched again. As the warship's weapons locked onto them, he could feel the burn of the ship's engines trying to push them away, but it was futile. The Exthar ship was too powerful. Reynolds knew they had seconds before they were vaporized. Before the Exthar decided to finish them off, they had to make a choice. Escape wasn't an option, so the only choice left was to face the enemy head on. The stealth ship was no match for the Exthar warship, but it could still be useful if they got close enough. "Prepare to board," Reynolds ordered, his voice grim but resolute. Harper's eyes widened. "You can't be serious." "I'm not letting them take us down without a fight," Reynolds snapped as he engaged the cloaking system. The small ship's hull shimmered with the effort as they slipped through the Exthar ship's detection grid, just long enough to reach its docking bay. The team below decks was ready to move the moment the ship made contact with the Exthar warship. They would board in full force and make their way to the heart of the enemy's stronghold, where Zilara was being held. The docking bay doors opened with a hiss and Reynolds led the way into the darkened halls of the Exthar warship. His pulse quickened, but he kept his focus. The faint sounds of alien footsteps echoed through the corridors as he motioned for his team to follow them into the depths of the enemy vessel, where danger awaited at every turn. "This is it," Reynolds whispered to himself as they moved deeper into the bowels of the ship, the air thick with tension. The hunt had begun, and there would be no turning back now. Reynolds stood frozen in place, his mind reeling from the revelation. The truth Zilara spoke seemed too impossible to grasp, yet the creature's words lingered in the air like an undeniable weight. Zilara wasn't just a princess, she wasn't just the key to a weapon, she was the key to ending the endless war between the Exthar and the Coral. But in the same breath, she also held the potential to destroy everything if the weapon inside her was unleashed unchecked. The weapon was no mere tool. It was a force that had the power to shape the very fabric of the galaxy, a force that was inherently tied to the Exthar people. But the very thought of Zilara controlling it was more than Reynolds could comprehend. "Why are you telling me this?" Reynolds finally asked, his voice hoarse, the words hard to form. Zilara didn't answer immediately, its long limbs shifting in an almost unsettling manner as it seemed to consider the question. Its black eyes seemed to pierce through him as if reading his every thought. "I'm telling you this because you're the only one who can stop it," Zilara said finally, its voice calm but intense. "I am no longer part of the Exthar. I have seen their true nature, the corruption that festers within them. I've watched Zilara struggle with the power she possesses. I've seen what the Exthar are willing to do to control it. And now it's too late. They'll stop at nothing to take her back and use her for their own gain." The creature paused, its eyes flickering to the team behind Reynolds, each member standing tense, ready for anything, but none of them moved. "Why trust me?" Reynolds asked despite himself. The doubt was still there, gnawing at him. The enemy was speaking, but could he trust anything coming from it? Could he trust this alien who had once been an enemy? Zilara tilted its head, a strange motion for something so alien. "Because I see what you are capable of," Zilara said quietly. I see your heart, your conviction. You are like Zilara in that way. You are both bound by your will to protect those you care for. You don't need to understand everything. You only need to act when the moment demands it. The words hit Reynolds harder than he expected. The sudden clarity of it all almost knocked the breath out of him. There was truth in what Zilara said. He didn't need to understand the full extent of the situation. He didn't need to grasp every detail. All he needed to know was that Zilara was at the center of something far bigger than the war, something that could change the galaxy forever. "What do you want from me?" Reynolds asked, his voice steadier now. The uncertainty was still there, but it was slowly being replaced by a sense of purpose. Zilara took a step closer, its form looming over Reynolds, but the weight of its presence wasn't threatening anymore. It was almost as if it were trying to convey something that transcended species, something deeper than their differences. "I want you to help her," Zilara said simply. "Help Zilara before she loses control, before the weapon takes her and everything around her. She's been raised to believe she's nothing but a tool, a weapon to be used and discarded. But she's more than that. She has the power to stop the war, to break the chains of her people, but she cannot do it alone." Reynolds exchanged a glance with Harper and the rest of his team. None of them spoke, but their eyes said everything. They had come to this place expecting to fight a battle with the Xthar, but now they were facing something far greater, something that none of them had prepared for, and yet here they were with an alien creature asking them to risk everything for a cause they barely understood. "We're in," Reynolds said after a moment, his voice low but resolute. Zilara nodded, once its dark eyes flickering with what might have been gratitude. "I knew you would be," it said. "Follow me, I'll take you to her. But be warned, the Xthar will stop at nothing to take her back, and we won't have much time once they realize what we're doing." The team moved swiftly as Zilara led them through the twisting corridors of the warship, their mission now clear. They had to find Zilara and free her before the Xthar could use her power to destroy everything the galaxy had fought so hard to build. But with every step they took, the uncertainty grew more palpable. They were stepping into a war that wasn't just about power or territory. It was about breaking a cycle of destruction that had lasted for centuries, a cycle that no one could escape until Zilara made her choice. The deeper they ventured into the Xthar warship, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. It was as if the very walls were closing in around them. The halls grew narrower, the air heavier, and the faint hum of the ship seemed to vibrate in their bones. Reynolds kept his hand tight around his weapon as they moved through the winding corridors, a soft sound of his team's footsteps, barely audible against the thick silence. Zilara led them with unerring confidence, its strange presence seeming to guide them through the darkness, its form a dark shadow in the flickering lights of the warship. Reynolds couldn't shake the unease gnawing at him despite Zirac's assurances. There was something wrong about all of this, something deeply unsettling. The more Zilara revealed, the less it made sense. Zilara was at the center of this cosmic struggle, but her power was as much a curse as a blessing. And now they were racing against time to reach her before the Xthar realized what was happening. The closer they got, the more Reynolds felt the weight of their mission pressing down on him. The stakes had never been higher, and yet it felt like they were flying blind. The door ahead was different from the others. It was much larger, adorned with strange symbols that seemed to shift and move in the dim light. Reynolds stopped just before it, his team following suit. He looked to Zilara, who nodded slowly, the creature's eyes glowing faintly in the dark. "She's behind this door," Zilara said, its voice carrying a weight of both urgency and dread. Reynolds motioned for Harper to get the breach charge ready, but before anyone could act, the door suddenly slid open on its own, the faint hiss of air escaping from within as the room beyond was revealed. It was like nothing Reynolds had ever seen before. The room was vast and yet entirely empty, except for a single figure at the center. Zilara stood motionless, her back to them, her body surrounded by a soft glow that pulsed in time with the rhythm of her breathing. Her hair was dark and long, her skin pale, but not as alien as he'd expected. In fact, she looked human in many ways, save for the strange markings that covered her arms and legs, which glowed with a faint purple light. Reynolds took a step forward, but the moment his foot crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind them with a violent hiss, trapping them inside the room. "No turning back now," Harper muttered under his breath, But there was no time for fear now. The mission had evolved into something far greater than they could have imagined. Zilara didn't move. She didn't even acknowledge their presence. She stood still as if lost in some kind of trance. And yet Reynolds could feel the immense power radiating off of her like a living storm. It was both terrifying and mesmerizing. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were standing on the edge of something monumental, something that would change the course of the galaxy. Zilara stepped forward, its voice low and almost pleading. "Zilara," it said softly, "it's time to wake up. You have to hear me. This is not your path. The Exar will use you to destroy everything you care about. You must resist." Zilara's head twitched, but she didn't turn to face them. She remained still, her body glowing brighter, and now the power inside her thrumming with energy that threatened to tear the room apart. Reynolds could feel the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. The air was charged with an electric hum, and he could almost feel the power reaching out toward him like a magnet pulling him closer. "We have to move now," Reynolds said, his voice tense as he motioned for his team to stay alert. Harper and the others moved cautiously into the room, weapons raised, but they didn't know what to expect. Nothing about this situation made sense. Zilara's body seemed to be reacting to something unseen, her power growing stronger with every passing second. Zilara reached out, but stopped just short of touching her. Zilara's gaze was like a storm, dark and turbulent. Her eyes glowed with that same purple light that had filled the room, pulsating with the power of the weapon locked inside her. Reynolds could see the conflict in her expression, the confusion, the fear. It was as if she didn't know who she was anymore. She was both the key to salvation and the harbinger of destruction, and the weight of that choice was more than any one person should have to bear. The air crackled around them as Zilara's body shuddered under the pressure of the power surging through her. Every breath she took seemed to make the very room tremble. Her lips parted, but no sound came out, as if she was struggling to speak or perhaps to remember the words she had lost in the chaos of her own mind. Reynolds could feel the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end, his hand hovering near his weapon. Even though he knew this wasn't a fight they could win with force, this was something different, something far more delicate than any battle he had fought before. Zilara stepped forward cautiously, its dark eyes fixed on Zilara, its voice a low whisper, almost drowned out by the humming energy filling the room. "Zilara, listen to me," Zilara said softly. "You don't have to carry this burden alone. You are not a weapon. You are a person. You have a choice. You can control this power. You can choose to stop the war. You can save your people. But you have to believe that you are more than just what they made you." Zilara's body trembled, as if the words struck her like a physical blow. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, and for the first time since they entered the room her expression softened, as if the weight of Zirac's words were beginning to break through the storm inside her. Reynolds couldn't help but take a step forward, his eyes never leaving Zilara as she stood at the center of the room fighting for control over her own fate. The power within her was raw, untamed, a force of nature that no one could truly understand. But if she could hold onto herself, if she could resist the urge to let it consume her, then maybe, just maybe, she could end this nightmare once and for all. Zilara, Reynolds said, his voice steady but full of emotion. "You're not alone in this. We're here to help you. No one can force you to be something you're not. The choice is yours, and whatever you decide, we'll be with you every step of the way." The words hung in the air for what felt like an eternity. The room was silent except for the faint hum of the energy swirling around them. The tension was unbearable. Reynolds could see the struggle on Zilara's face, the way her hands clenched and unclenched, as if she were fighting to hold onto herself. The power inside her was threatening to break free, but something in her eyes had changed. The storm was subsiding just slightly enough for Reynolds to believe that she might be able to control it. Finally, after what felt like an age, Zilara spoke, her voice a soft rasp, barely audible of the hum of the energy. I don't know who I am anymore," she whispered, her eyes filled with tears. "They made me into this. I didn't ask for this power. I didn't ask to be their weapon." Her voice broke, but she didn't falter. She stood tall despite the weight of her own doubts. "But I won't let them use me anymore. I won't let them control me." The words were a lifeline, the clarity in her voice like the first breath of fresh air after being trapped underwater. Reynolds' heart lifted with the hope that they could still save her from herself, save her from the thing that had been done to her. Zurak nodded, its eyes glistening with something that might have been pride or hope. "You are more than they ever thought you could be," Zurak said quietly. "Now you must choose to break free of them to end this cycle once and for all." Kilara closed her eyes again, taking a deep breath, as if she were grounding herself in the very core of her being. She reached out, with trembling hands, her fingers brushing the air, as if seeking something invisible but vital. "I choose to be free," she whispered so softly that Reynolds wasn't sure he'd heard it correctly, but he had heard it, and it was enough. In that moment, the energy around her flared brightly, illuminating the entire room. The pulse of the power that had consumed her now seemed to stabilize, as if she had claimed it as her own. The room hummed with a deep, resonating power, but it was no longer chaotic, no longer a force that sought to destroy. It was focused, controlled. Kilara's eyes opened once more, and this time they were calm, no longer glowing with that intense purple light, but steady and clear, like someone who had finally found their way out of the darkness. "I will end this war," Kilara said with conviction, her voice stronger now. "I will choose the future, not the past." The air in the room shifted dramatically. The energy that had been swirling uncontrollably now hummed with a steady pulse, like the beat of a heart, a force contained, but still immense. Kilara stood at the center of it, her eyes no longer filled with the chaos of the weapon's power, but with a calm resolve, a clarity that Reynolds hadn't seen in her before. He could feel the change in her, the transformation from a girl burdened by a power she couldn't control to a leader who had finally taken charge of her own destiny. Reynolds could feel a strange sense of relief flood through him. For the first time since they'd entered the warship, the weight of the mission felt lighter, as if they weren't just fighting against the Extha anymore. They were fighting for something bigger, something that transcended the violence and the hatred that had defined this war for so long. The chance to break free from the cycle of destruction that had ensnared both the Extha and the Coral. Kilara took a deep breath and turned to face them. Her expression was no longer one of confusion or fear, but one of determination, her voice steady and sure as she spoke. "We need to leave now," she said quietly, but with purpose. "The Extha know we're here, and they won't stop until they have me back. They'll do anything to get their hands on the weapon again." Reynolds nodded. The plan had changed now. It wasn't just about rescuing Kilara, it was about getting her out of here before the Extha could capture her again. But there was more at stake than just her life now. With her control over the weapon, the balance of power had shifted, and they were no longer running from the enemy, they were preparing to face them head-on. Zurak stepped forward, its voice low but full of urgency. "We must hurry, they will not give us another chance." Zurak said, its dark eyes flickering with a knowing fear. "The Extha will have already deployed their forces to stop us, and we are not prepared for a direct confrontation." Reynolds glanced at his team. They had trained for 100 different scenarios, but this was nothing like what they had imagined. They weren't prepared to fight an entire fleet, but they had no choice now. There was no going back. Kilara had made her decision, and now they had to make theirs. "We move fast, we move quiet," Reynolds said, his voice sharp with command. "Harper, you're with me. We'll cover the front. Kilara, stay with Zurak. And stay close, don't take any chances. The rest of you follow our lead." Harper nodded immediately, his hand on his weapon. As he fell into step beside Reynolds, the rest of the team took their positions, as well, scanning the dark corridors for any signs of movement. The atmosphere was tense, but there was a fire in Reynolds' chest, now a fire that hadn't been there before when they'd entered the warship. It was no longer just about survival, it was about something bigger, something worth fighting for, and the stakes had never been higher. They moved quickly and silently through the ship's corridors, the mission now clear. They had to reach the ship's docking bay, where their shuttle was waiting, but the closer they got to their destination, the more the air seemed to grow thick with danger. Every corner held the potential for an ambush. Every turn could lead to an enemy patrol. Reynolds' heart raced with each passing moment, but he kept his focus ahead of him. The way forward was uncertain, but there was no turning back now. They were committed to the fight, and they had one goal in mind. They had to get Kilara to safety before the Extha could stop them. They reached a large intersection just outside the docking bay, and Reynolds froze, a cold chill running down his spine. The sound of heavy footsteps echoed through the hallway, an unmistakable sign that the enemy was close. They had been found. ambush Harper whispered, his voice tight with urgency. Reynolds didn't hesitate. He raised his weapon and motioned for his team to spread out. "Prepare for contact," he said sharply. The footsteps grew louder, and then from the shadows emerged a squad of Xthar soldiers, their weapons raised and their eyes locked onto Reynolds' team with a deadly intensity. They had been waiting for this moment, and now they would not let them escape. The docking bay was just ahead, but the journey there felt like an eternity. Every corner they turned, every door they passed seemed to grow more perilous. The weight of the Xthar forces bearing down on them never relented. The air was thick with tension. The very walls seemed to pulse with the vibrations of their pursuit. Reynolds felt his pulse quicken, every step an urgent beat. As they neared the final stretch of their mission, the team was focused, their movements swift and coordinated. But they knew they were running out of time. With every passing second, the enemy closed in, and if they didn't get to the shuttle soon, they would be trapped. Reynolds glanced over at Zilara. She was moving with purpose, now her eyes fixed forward, no longer lost in the chaos of her power, no longer bound by the weapon that had been forced upon her. She was walking beside Zirak, her confidence growing with every step. The room around them seemed to grow stiller as her presence commanded the space. She was no longer a prisoner of her own abilities. She had embraced them. And with that came a calm strength that radiated outward. She was leading them now, not the Xthar, not the weapon, not the destiny they had tried to impose on her, but Zilara, the person, the leader she had always been inside. Harper led the way through the final corridor. Ahead, the shuttle bay doors loomed. They could see it now, just beyond the glass, the small transport waiting for them, the hum of its engines, a beacon of hope in the chaos. But as they rounded the last corner, their way was blocked by a new threat, a massive wall of Xthar soldiers standing firm and ready, their weapons trained directly on them. Reynolds cursed under his breath. They had reached the shuttle too late. The Xthar had anticipated their move, and now they were trapped with nowhere to go. "We don't have time for this." Reynolds said, his voice low but full of resolve. He turned to Zilara. "You have to use your power now. You have to take control before they overwhelm us." Zilara nodded without hesitation, her expression hardening. As she raised her hands, the air around them vibrated with energy. The very ground beneath their feet seemed to hum as she drew from the well of power within her. Reynolds could feel it too, the raw force, the tremendous weight of it. Like a storm ready to break, the Xthar soldiers faltered for just a moment before raising their weapons again in defiance. "You can't stop me." Zilara's voice rang out clear and strong. The Xthar hesitated at the sound of it, her words like a declaration not just to them, but to the entire galaxy, that she would no longer be a tool for anyone's war. The power surged outward with a force that pushed the Xthar soldiers back, their weapons shaking in their hands. As Zilara's control over the weapon grew tighter and tighter, they staggered in the wake of her power. But Zilara did not destroy them. No, she held them in place with the force of her, with each of them immobilized, unable to move. As her presence dominated the room, the soldiers couldn't comprehend what was happening. They had underestimated her. They had thought her a weapon to be controlled, but now she had become the master of that very power. "We have to go," Reynolds shouted as the team moved forward, the Xthar soldiers still frozen by Zilara's will. But he knew this wouldn't last long. They were on borrowed time. The team reached the shuttle with Zilara at the forefront, her control unwavering. She stepped onto the transport with the rest of the team following quickly behind. But Reynolds paused for a moment, just before entering, looking back at the Xthar soldiers who still stood motionless in the bay, not dead, not injured, but held by a power that was not theirs. Reynolds turned away with a sense of finality. They had done it. They had gotten Zilara to safety, and in doing so had taken the first step toward changing the course of the galaxy forever. The shuttle doors closed with a soft hiss, and the engines roared to life as they lifted off the ground, the warship shrinking beneath them. As they soared into the vast expanse of space, the stars stretched out before them, a sea of possibilities. Zilara sat quietly in her seat, her eyes still glowing faintly as the power within her pulsed like a heartbeat, steady and controlled. For the first time she seemed at peace with herself, her hands resting gently in her lap. Reynolds glanced at her and then at his team. They had come so far from the moment they had set foot on the warship to this point, and yet the journey was far from over. The war between the Exthar and the Korel was not yet finished, but the hope that had been reignited in Clyra was the spark they needed to change everything. She had chosen to break the cycle of violence, she had chosen to end the war, and now they would help her see it through. "We did it," Harper said quietly, a grin tugging at the corners of his mouth. Reynolds nodded, his eyes fixed on Clyra, her future, and now her own, to shape her destiny in her hands, not as a weapon, not as a tool, but as a leader, a beacon of hope in a galaxy torn by war. "Yeah," Reynolds said softly, "we did."